Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Michael, thank you very much for being here. I guess I'm going to ask you the same question that we've asked some other folks that have testified in favor of Senate Bill 5, which is, you mentioned 4 or 5 times in your testimony voters of color. And, I want to say from the outset that obviously any sort of discrimination or racism is wrong. And I will work with this committee to end racism and discrimination in any way possible. Every time that it's brought up, I don't see the racism. I see discrimination based on populations or communities that are high density or urban environment, stuff like that. But you're not affecting only people of color, as you mentioned. So can you give me an example that has to do with a voting law or provision in our policies that is actually discriminatory based on race or any other protected class? Through you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you for your question, Senator. I think it's an important question, and I'm glad you raised it. The Connecticut Voting Rights Act, and indeed the Federal Voting Rights Act, focuses on policies or practices that have a racially discriminatory effect. If there's a practice or a policy that leads to disparities, plaintiffs don't need to prove that the government officials intended to discriminate. They don't need to prove that there was racial animus in enacting the policy, although sometimes there is. That's not a necessary element. The focus of these laws is to look at policies that have racially disparate effects because of our country's history of laws, of practices that do just that make it more difficult for communities of color to elect candidates of their choice. And I can give you some examples. Consider, for instance, and this is a hypothetical, a town that placed situated polling places in convenient locations in white communities, but didn't situate polling places in convenient locations in communities of color. Right now, it is very challenging for voters of color to vindicate their rights. Those cases are expensive and burdensome. Oftentimes, they're not resolved for years. This would give voters tools, efficient tools, to address those issues, and it would also implement procedures to prevent those types of problems from going into effect in the first place. Let me give you another example in sort of the districting concept. Imagine there's a locality that uses an at-large election structure for its local elections, for its local council elections. And there's a community of color within that municipality, but because the elections are at large, that community of color is consistently outvoted, and they are never able to elect candidates from their community. This would give a mechanism to resolve those sorts of structures that have a racially dilutive effect. But again, the critical test in this law and the Federal Voting Rights Act is to look at laws that have racially discriminatory effects, where there are disparities when you compare the outcomes based on turnout based on race.
Thank you for that answer. And you said the same thing everyone else said, though, Michael. Forgive me. And I guess I had a conversation with Senator Lesser on the same subject, and I suggested to him. I said, look, if the problem is that the city of Bridgeport, for example, is predominantly minority populations, and they are disenfranchised because the precincts are larger, and therefore you have to stand in line. Wouldn't the solution be to do something to affect policy that requires that voting precincts cannot exceed 10,000 people, for instance? I guess my concern about this is not so much the policy that you're after or your concern over its disparate effect on people of color, as you mentioned. It's the constant case being made that this is all happening because of an attack on people of color, and I just don't see that. I mean, the city of Bridgeport is run by the Democrat Party, has been for 50 years. Are you telling me that the city of Bridgeport municipal government is responsible for setting up voting places and rules that negatively impact people of color? Through you, Madam Chairman.
Senator, so thank you for that question, and I think you're hitting on important issues and important points. Right now, if there are voters of color in a community where they are noticing disparities, where they are finding obstacles voting, it's very difficult for them to resolve those issues. But again, the point of this bill is not to target jurisdictions, not to say that there is that there's a widespread intentional discrimination in voting. The focus here is to look at jurisdictions where there is a disparate effect in access and where voters aren't at an equal playing field. Now, Senator, there are different circumstances town by town. I mean, I'm sure that everybody on this committee has grappled with this issue that towns have different challenges that they face, different parameters, different structures in place, and discrimination and disparities in access can present in many different ways. It can happen at the point at which voters go in to cast their ballot. It can happen in the absentee ballot process. It can happen in redistricting. The purpose of this bill is to give voters a tool to efficiently and effectively protect their rights, the rights that are protected under the U.S. Constitution, the rights that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted. This would give voters in Connecticut and voters of color in Connecticut tools to protect their rights, and it's modeled off of bills in other states that have worked quite well. In California, for instance, which passed its Voting Rights Act back in 2001, hundreds of violations have been resolved out of court without hundreds or thousands or millions of dollars in legal fees, because voters had an opportunity and a mechanism in place to send a letter to a jurisdiction saying, hey, wait a second, we think this structure, we think this election structure is problematic, and work with the jurisdiction to resolve that violation. It makes these claims more predictable and easier to resolve for courts, and it's modeled off of the good work that's happening in other states.
I appreciate the very lengthy answer. It seems like we're talking past each other. I guess I'm a solutions-oriented person, and for me, I just want the solution. And the solution is if voters are being disenfranchised, regardless of what their background or race or gender or whatever, protected or otherwise class that they come from, I want everyone to have the same access. And I think they do. The fact is, Michael, nothing you said was an example of a law or a provision or a voting place that is altered for people of color. There are people who of all races and ethnicities that are affected by these policies. I mean, the city of Bridgeport, every voting precinct has African American, Hispanic, and white, and Asian, and who knows who else voters. So it's not targeting any specific group other than to say Bridgeport voters in that community. And if you say you want to affect change to help Bridgeport voters in that community, I'm with you 100%. I will fight tooth and nail to make sure that they have as much access to voting as anyone else in the state. But what I would take exception to is the constant hammering that this is about systemic racism, because it's not. It just stands to reason that our urban cities have dense populations, they have limited funding, they have democratic governments predominantly, and those are the governments that are setting up the rules for the voting. And I'm sure you're the last person who would suggest to me that it's that Democrat town government that is responsible for those racial discrepancies and disparities. So let's work together, put past this thing. And again, I will ask you one more time, if you can give me an example of a law we need to change or a provision we need to put into law that says a town can't do X or should do Y, that is going to, that already affects different races differently and disparately, not communities, like I keep pointing out is what you're actually talking about, then let's change it. But I don't think there is one. So if it is communities that need to be fixed, let's fix those communities and work on the solutions without trying to make this a political issue of race. It's just, you know, I want to work with my counterparts on this committee. I want to hear from groups like the NAACP who have obviously represent a constituency of concern, and I'm not legitimizing your concern, but I think it's being tailored in a way that's not accurate. It is voters in Bridgeport or voters in Hartford that are being affected, not just Black and brown voters. We need to be concerned about all those folks, don't we? Because I don't care if you're white, Black, brown, Asian, whatever. If you're being disenfranchised and have to stand in line for 10 hours in Bridgeport, that's wrong, and we should fix it. And we should be concerned about everybody, regardless of their ethnic background. And I'm sorry for going off the rails, Madam Chairman. I really do appreciate your testimony. I do want to see a bill like this go forward, but I want it to be based in truth and reason and not just political hyperbole. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator, for your. I'm sorry, Senator Flexer.
No, Mr. Pernick, if you'd like to respond, go right ahead.
Thank you very much for your question, Senator Sampson, and I do appreciate the points that you're making. Let me say a couple of quick things. First, racial discrimination in voting and racial disparities, they don't happen today from bills that specifically target and specifically name individual races. They are facially neutral bills, laws that structure elections in particular ways that have racial disparities in their effect. And that's why laws like Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that are effects-based tests are very important and have allowed communities of color to vindicate their rights across the country, including here in Connecticut, where there was a significant Section 2 Voting Rights Act case in the 90s. The purpose of this bill is to allow those claims to be brought, or specifically the purpose of the private rights of action is to allow those claims to be brought more efficiently, more effectively, to give jurisdictions a safe harbor so they can resolve violations without the burden and expense of this complicated area of the law, and to give voters tools to vindicate their own rights. So I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate your willingness to collaborate. I would love to continue this conversation and find a way to work together to protect the right to vote for all voters in Connecticut.
Can I just ask one more question to you, Madam Chairman? That is, Michael, do you know if Section 2 allows voters, regardless of their ethnic background, to have that same right of action, or is it only limited to certain folks? And when I say that, go ahead. Answer the question. I'll ask a follow-up. All right. Well, I was going to say, if it does not do that, does it limit the right of action only to racial discrimination, which might preclude a white voter, for example? Through you, Madam Chairman. So,
Senator, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act protects against voting discrimination on the basis of race, color, or language access. So it is specifically targeted at historical discrimination based on race, color, or language access. It comes out of, it was passed in 1965, enacted to combat decades of discrimination in voting across the country.
I'm asking about the bill before us that creates the right of action in Section 2 of, I think it's Senate Bill 820.
I understand. The bill before us is modeled directly on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, so it has the same definition of protected class as the Federal Voting Rights Act and tracks federal law on that point.
All right. So I guess my only concern about that, and I would be very supportive of that language. My only concern, though, is that if you're a white voter in Bridgeport and you're being disenfranchised the same way as your African-American neighbor, because you're both standing in line at 10 o'clock at night after being there for hours, you don't have a right of action because you are not being racially discriminated against. And I would argue that your Black neighbor isn't either. You're being discriminated against because you live in a community that doesn't care about the size or wait time of the voting district. And I would just point that out, that that's the problem that needs to be solved. And I hope that the bill considers that going forward, and that maybe we can work on it in a way that solves the problem without the focus on the political divisions that exist in our world. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for your questions. I don't.